The issues we navigate as a society, after all, will only intensify. The disinformation will only increase. The pull into the comfort of our tribes will be magnified. But we have it within us to ensure that that doesn't mean we fracture. We are richer for our difference and poorer for our division.
That was quite a speech that you gave a couple of months ago to this year's graduates at Harvard University. Do you really think, as you said in that speech, that personal empowerment can save democracy from the threat of social media disinformation?
I mean, that's not for a moment to take away the responsibility that our social media platforms and online operators have. And I spent a bit of time in that speech talking about where I believe we need to go together, government, civil society, and those platforms. But I think it is fair to say that we have tools now that do need to demonstrate great responsibility. We know that the content that we consume is curated for us. Let's have more transparency around how that's done, because it is having an impact on our democracies and our day-to-day lives.
So in 2019, a racist right-wing terrorist murdered a large number of people in 2 New Zealand mosques.
Yes.
He was radicalised.
Yeah, he was.
Online. Did that turn you into an advocate for government regulation of social media platforms?
I think it turned New Zealand into advocates for change. And I think what we have to recognise with these tools, and what in many cases actually can be powerful tools for good as well, it turned us into advocates for ensuring that in those spaces where you see rapid technological advancement, actually regulation has a part to play, but it won't always be able to keep up with the change that we see. And so we advocated that we all play our part. And that's what the Christchurch call to action was. It was to bring to the table civil society, government and the tech companies and say, for each of our responsibilities, we need to take action, because we can all agree that no one wants to see online platforms or the internet generally used to radicalise or create violent extremism, and yet that is what we are seeing.
Let's move to the Pacific, because obviously that's going to be a major focus of your meetings with Anthony Albanese and obviously at the Pacific Forum next week. Do you see your government as being in a strategic partnership with Australia to counter China's growing influence in the region?
I think that, Australia and New Zealand have a long-standing friendship.
The world is changing. Forgive me for interrupting, but the world has clearly changed. Is it changing your relationship with Australia?
No, I don't believe so, actually. If anything, I think in many ways it brings us closer together. We have many shared values. You wouldn't find economically a closer relationship than New Zealand and Australia. We often refer to Australia as family, and that brings with it, the ability to speak frankly with one another when we disagree. But within the Pacific, we also, New Zealand sees itself of the Pacific. We see ourselves as this being both how we identify, but also where we have a responsibility. And I see that same approach from Australia too.
How threatening would it be to the security both of New Zealand and of Australia if China establishes a military presence in the Solomon Islands?
Yeah, well, we've been very clear that we're opposed to the militarisation of the region. But look, we can take that position in a country-neutral way. It doesn't matter whom. It's a position we take broadly on, from a New Zealand perspective. But here, actually, we fall back again to the regional architecture we have in the Pacific, and that's the Pacific Island Forum. We've explicitly, within the Bikitawa and Boe declarations, we've all signed up to the idea that should we have security challenges ourselves as Pacific members, that we resolve those and address those together. And that's all that we've called for.
As you just said, you're also very conscious of respecting the sovereignty of those nations.
Absolutely.
So how far can you go without appearing to bully?
No, and this is where we're really clear. Look, China has had relationships in our region for many, many years. And so let's of course not forget that. But we've always also within the Pacific Island Forum been very clear. If it comes to security issues, if it comes to issues that could be conceived to be militarisation, there we have agreement that we come together and we discuss that as a forum because that affects all of us.
With all the domestic, economic and all the pandemic pressures in New Zealand, did you miss what China was up to in the Solomons?
Well, again, here I think it's important to point out our Pacific neighbours have long had relationships with China. That is not new. What we have an eye to, though, is whether or not those relationships continue to uphold the values that we have as a region. First, Pacific priorities first, and actually the Pacific priorities are climate change first and foremost. Making sure, again, that when it comes to our security needs, that we work with one another. So, in fact, I think the Pacific has been very consistent, but we do see change around us in approach. But for the most part, the Pacific continues to respond in the same way they always have.
But were you blindsided? Was it an intelligence failure by both New Zealand and Australia?
No, I think it actually, to be fair, I've actually pushed back on that sentiment because, again, I feel that doesn't acknowledge the sovereignty of Pacific Island nations to determine their own relationships. It is not for New Zealand or Australia to dictate the relationships that Pacific Island neighbours have with others.
Just to go back to that question, what kind of a threat would it pose if China were to establish a military presence, however?
Look, for us, the position is very clear. We believe that escalation in our region and militarisation in our region is not necessary, not called for and not wanted. So we're very clear on that.
In response to China's military expansion, Australia is planning to build a fleet of nuclear submarines with the assistance of the US and the UK. At the same time, does New Zealand plan to expand its naval and air forces to join in this tougher response?
Well, again, it would be for Australia to, I think, identify the imperative behind the decisions that they make in terms of their own capability and fleet. That's ultimately for them. Look, for us, you can see in our defence strategy that we're very much Pacific focused, and that's because of who we are and where we are. And so a lot of what we're responding to in our region is actually one of the greatest security threats that we face, which is climate change.
You say before country neutral, but you were recently on the stage at NATO, and NATO obviously issued a new strategy that recognised a threat from China for the first time. Have you moved now beyond that point of neutrality? It's certainly how the Chinese see it.
I think it's important not to confuse the term country neutral with neutrality or not entering into the fray on foreign policy issues as they emerge. Simply, when we talk in that way, the point we're making is we have a very strong set of values, and that actually it's not about targeting any one individual country. If we see others who don't share those values and breach, for instance, the international rules-based order, we will speak up about that. And so, for instance, if an example is, the obviously illegal war in Ukraine, we will speak up about that. We will put in place, as we have, sanctions. We will respond in a very direct way. And you'll see other examples that we, for instance, issues we've raised to the Human Rights Council around the plight of the Uyghur people. It's very much, if it's in breach of our values, regardless of who it is, we will speak up on that.
At the same time, China is your biggest trading partner, and at a time when the New Zealand economy is really struggling. How do you confront China? Well, I think everyone's economy is struggling.
Sure.
I'm not singling you out. Obviously, an aggressive raise in interest rates, we're all battling with the same forces.
Sure. I would just point out our relatively low levels of debt, historically low unemployment, and good solid GDP growth. But apart from that, we are experiencing CPI increases.
Thank you very much. Tourism New Zealand. There is a global economic challenge,
absolutely.
A significant one. So how do you confront your biggest trading partner without threatening your economic interests?
I think here, we've been clearly of the view that trade and having strong trading relationships is actually, in our view, in our region's interest. But that should never stop any nation from being able to equally voice concerns about issues that they see in their region or that affect them as a nation. And so when it comes to New Zealand's trading relationships, we continue to seek, mature, and we believe we have a maturing relationship with China. They are our number one trading partner, but equally we seek a very consistent approach where we will voice where we have concern, seek, through diplomacy to resolve those concerns.
Is it getting harder to thread the needle?
Oh, well, look, in our minds we've continued to be fairly consistent. Not much about the way New Zealand's conducted its foreign policy has changed. The environment we operate in has, though.
Are there any circumstances in which you would allow Australian nuclear submarines into New Zealand ports?
Our policy on nuclear free won't change, but actually, I've only ever encountered understanding and appreciation of that position. New Zealand bears the scar of nuclear testing in our region. We've taken a strong principled position, and will continue to do so. That doesn't change the relationship we have with Australia or their understanding of our position.
I just want to talk a little bit about you'll push back on this, no doubt, but I just want to talk about the phenomenon of Jacinda Ardern. It's very unusual for a Prime Minister of a small Pacific country to become a global celebrity. How do you explain the sustained interest in you?
Oh, I don't think I would ever, first of all, describe myself in that way.
I think the rest of the world would.
Well, I guess it's there. I guess, gosh, that would be for them. For me, I will forever, first and foremost, be the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and my focus is totally on our nation. And look, if by virtue of just doing that job to the very best of my ability, there is some interest in what New Zealand does and how we do it, then I will always reflect that back to the fact that all I do is magnify the Kiwi spirit.
I wonder if it's a generational thing that there is a purpose to celebrity and media that you understand more instinctively.
My only focus, aside from, of course, doing the very best job I can, is to still also display the fact that ultimately politicians are also very human. And I think we do have a job to allow ourselves to display a little more of that, because ultimately we want people to be attracted to politics. We want people to want to do the job. And I think if we give off the air that you have to be completely ironclad and almost so resilient as to not be human, that people won't see themselves necessarily wanting to enter into the fray. And so I think that we have a job to do to just bring a bit more humanity to the role.
How does it feel to be more popular abroad than it is at home?
Again, as I say, my total focus is at home. That's what matters to me.
Jacinda Ardern, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.